Hello, my name is Frank Thier, and this is my M5 explanation video where we'll be talking about exceptions. So first, let's talk about the flow of control with a try-catch finally. So let's say that we need to call a method that throws an exception, and we know that withdraw throws an exception, or a couple of them. So in order to do that, we have to surround, we can either say we throw the exception up in the method declaration, or we can use the try catch finally, or just try catch, depending on what you need to do. So we are essentially saying, hey, Java, try to execute this code. And if an exception is thrown, catch it, catch this specific exception, and then do something about that, right? So we can throw as many catches in here as we need to. If withdraw through 20 different exceptions, we could have 20 different catches. And then finally is going to execute no matter what. So, you know, if try works perfectly, finally we'll say, okay, cool, let's execute. If try fails and an exception is thrown, we will handle it, and then finally it's like, okay, cool, you handled it, and now I'm going to execute. So in either situation, finally is going to execute. So when would you use the try catch? Well, kind of already talked about it a little bit, but if you're gonna call any method that is going to throw an exception, you need to surround it with a try catch, or you could throw it. But you probably want to do something actually, specific about that. So, that's why I chose to use this as an example, because we want to get as much as possible. So if we have this insufficient funds exception, if we try to withdraw more money than is in our bank account, we're going to do something very specific about that. And so that is when we would want to use the try catch. Okay, I can edit that out. Um, yeah, so that's when you would want to use the try catch. How to throw an exception. So let's say that our withdraw method here, we want it to throw two different exceptions in two different situations. So if our amount is going to be less than or equal to 0, we want to throw a new invalid amount exception. And so we're going to use the throw keyword, new keyword, and then our exception, because this is throwing a new exception object, right? Exceptions are objects, just like other objects when we use the new keyword. And then, same thing down here. If the amount is greater than our balance, we're going to throw an insufficient funds exception. And so that is when you would use the throw and how you throw it. How to write a custom exception. So because we are using this example, I'll just keep talking about this one. So it's pretty basic, but it's just another class, just like everything in Java. So we have public class insufficient funds exception, and it's going to extend exception. So we're going to inherit the fields and methods of exception, and which means that we can use the superclass constructor, because this is just a basic. All we really want to do is change our error message to something custom, and so that's what we're going to do. We're just going to call the superclass constructor the exception constructor with this parameter, and it is our custom error message for an insufficient funds exception. And same thing here, it's basically the same exact idea. If we wanted to extend a runtime exception, we would just extend runtime exception, and then that would give us the fields and methods of the runtime exception. And so I guess let me talk about the checked and unchecked now that I've kind of thrown that example in there. So a regular exception is a checked exception. So the compiler is checking all of these exceptions for us. And so that's why we need to do try catch. That's why we need to do throws, because the compiler is, here I'll show an example right here. The compiler has our back. And so this is kind of a weird exception recursion almost, but we're trying to call withdraw and we handle the insufficient funds, but because we're calling withdraw again and there's no, this isn't surrounded by try catch, we have to declare that, hey, this method can throw an exception, and so that way the compiler knows that and is able to check that. So we're going to add the throws back in there, and then boom, the compiler is happy now. So an unchecked exception is a runtime exception, which means that we can do whatever we write our code to do, the compiler is not going to complain. It's going to let us do it. But let's say that my example is an index out of bounds exception. So we just have this basic int array right here with 4 ints, right? So let's say we want to print out the 4th index of a length of 4 array. Well, we know that that doesn't exist, right? Because it starts at 0. So we're actually trying to print out an index that does not exist. And so you can see here that I didn't need any try catch. I didn't need to, well, these throws are for the get as much as possible. I wouldn't say throws runtime exception. That's not the way that it works in Java. So the compiler is going to let us do this, and of course we're going to see, let's run this code, and we're going to have a crash and our program terminated because we have the array index out of bounds exception, which is a runtime exception. Because Java executes line by line, the first part right here worked just perfectly because we caught that exception. We passed in a amount of 500 to the getter as much as possible, but of course we only deposited 400. And so because the amount that we were trying to get out is more than we had, we caught the insufficient funds exception, we reassigned that amount, and then we just withdrew the correct amount. And then of course, like I promised earlier, the withdrew as much as possible print line right here is going to execute because it is in the finally block. And as you can see here, we have the finally block. The amount withdrawn is 400 instead of 500. And then we have this runtime exception, which crashed our program. So hopefully you have a little bit better understanding of exceptions. Of course, if you have any questions, please leave a comment, and